Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session, Echoes of Tomorrow, which is, of course, a celebration of the Future Forum's inaugural Science Fiction Short Story Prize. Yep. Thank you to the organizers for embracing science fiction and running a wonderful competition. And thank you as well to the DreamWorks Collective for supporting the prize. So my name is Glyn Morgan. I was one of the judges. And I'm curatorial lead for exhibitions at the Science Museum in London, where I curated our big science fiction exhibition. But my most relevant plug for you is that I have a chapter in a new book that's just been published called Cultivating Futures Thinking in Museums, which is edited by Kristin Alford and is now out from Routledge. So do go check that out. I am joined here by my two fellow judges on the end, and I'll introduce them first. So at the far end from me is Ashraf Fagih, who is a Saudi academic and novelist who was amongst the first in the Gulf region to venture into science fiction. He writes short stories and historical novels and is well known for his thought-provoking narratives. And just inside from him is Suyi Davies Okungbowa, who is the award-winning author of various science fiction and other speculative works. His debut novel won the 2020 Nomo Award for Best Novel, and if you don't know the Nomos, they're a brilliant award given every year by the African Speculative Fiction Society. Well worth checking out. His short work is widely published. His most recent novel is Lost Ark Dreaming, and he is Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Ottawa in Ontario, Canada. We are also very, very delighted to be joined by our three finalists. So to my immediate left, we have Cillian MacDonald, whose story was called The Last Selkie. And Cillian is a narrative futurist and writer specializing in blending tradition with innovation in a celebration of local heritage. She is the European lead for AI business solutions at APCO, a global advisory and advocacy firm, and the former curator of the World Economic Forum's Global Shaper Edinburgh Hub. She is the co-author of The Kepler Files, an apprentice oral storyteller of Scottish folklore, and currently seeking representation for her debut young adult science fantasy novel. So if there are any agents in the audience, you know who to come to. To her left is Zainab Ahmed, whose story was called The Lifeline. Zainab is an avid reader and writer based here in Dubai. Having studied visual communication design at the American University of Sharjah, her fascination with storytelling extends to both its literary and visual forms. When she isn't speculating on the disruptive consequences of modern technology on humanity, she enjoys illustrating for children's books, fashion, winters in Dubai, and spending time with family and friends. So you should do the book cover for Cillian's debut novel. There you go. And then finally, last but by no means least, is Mohammed Abu Hawash. He is an Arab writer and researcher who hails from Palestine and Jordan. He grew up in the Gulf region where he was immersed in Arab and Islamic culture. He's passionate about history, politics, and creative work. His fiction writings have explored the themes of Palestinian liberation and the future of Arab and Islamic societies. His non-fiction writings and research have focused on water politics, Middle Eastern geopolitics, and Arab-Islamic history, amongst other issues. He is currently working as senior research assistant at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha, Qatar, and previously served as a research and communications officer at the Embassy of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in Washington, D.C. Now that I've introduced us all, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a break from talking for just a minute. We're going to start out with an extract from one of our stories. About halfway through the session, I will ask for another extract from another one of our writers, and then we'll end with one as well. So we're going to do these in the order in which they came in the competition. So out of the many, I can't even remember what the total number of entries was, nearly 200, something like that? Lots. There was a lot of reading. Out of all of those entries, these are our top three. You can read all of the stories by the top 10 on the Future Forum's website. They're now live there. But yeah, to give us a little taste of that, please, Cillian, would you like to read us an extract from your story?
Yes. Thank you so much, Glyn. What I will say before I enter my extract is for those of you who probably aren't all familiar with Scottish folklore. The Selkie is a character in Scottish folklore that is very, in a way like a mermaid, but they're seals that can come and shed their seal skin and turn into humans, which is a big theme in my story. My grandmother holds my 2-year-old daughter in a distant embrace. She doesn't look like a Shetlander. Mother, Mum scolds. They see Fiona's darker skin and the coiled texture of her hair and think that's what Mamo refers to. Somehow, I know what Mamo saw in my daughter. And it isn't there as though the colors of the myriad dancers wouldn't reflect right in the eyes of someone who may never see them for herself beyond a simulation. Or that the splash of the sea wouldn't pearl into droplets in the same pattern on her toes if she didn't grow up with them buried in the cold, seaweed-coated sand. Mamo doesn't see a child that could be wrapped in the skin of a seal. Had she once said the same thing over my cradle, or at least wondered it? I snatched Fiona from Grandma's lap. This child, my child, is our family's future, not our past. The past isn't meant to survive. As I turned to find one of Fiona's toys, I only noticed that Grandma stacked a few of her favorite sweaters near her beloved chair, the ones in a fisheries pattern from our specific aisle. She didn't look at me when she cut the cuff off one and began to unravel the yarn. By morning, the spools of yarn from 3 famished sweaters rest on the shelf where we'd begun to keep Fiona's things, and a new blanket started on Grandma's needles. When Fiona cries from the nursery for her formula, goosebumps race up my arms as her cries echo an eerie sea. Grandma's been gone since Fiona's 5th birthday, yet today, her ashes are what I notice most when we return from the doctor. She's just the first layer in the new government-issued urn on the mantle, allowing us an ounce of ashes from the Biological Recycling Center as a memory. I wonder who my ashes will rest between, and if the layers will mix when the urn is one day moved off planet. When that happens, will it matter if mine are layered before or after Fiona's? And will I still be able to spend eternity with my baby girl enveloped in my embrace? Max and I haven't spoken on the glide home. He slips away to Fiona's room where he'll fall asleep at her side. I can't watch her sleep anymore. Her room is clinical and cold, no matter how I try to drown out the beefs and soften the bedding. When I'm alone, I turn on the live stream window to the croft. Show me the sea, I whisper. There's no aurora tonight, and to get a clearer view, the streaming drone shines its light to illuminate the coast. I dreamed of a lifetime for my daughter to see an aurora simulation at the Cultural Center. But if I only had time to give her one sight, would it not have been better to dream for the real thing? The coastline is now wild, untamed paradise, with native grasses swaying in the wind and seabirds nestling undisturbed. Seals bask on the rock, and otters play in the kelp-rich waters. There's no path constantly trodden as the woman who came before me walked down to the sea in the moonlight, listening to the sea's call and singing the song in our bones. Grandma rebuilt that path, and I never cared to watch it again.
Thank you. Thank you, Cillian. So your story was The Last Selkie. It was a really poetic and lovely story, which, as you say, brought in elements of Celtic or Norse mythology, this Selkie figure. What was the appeal for you of blending myth, which is not normally considered, scientific, with science fiction and, everything that we think of science fiction being?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it came from, I always sort of have a lot of the folklore and the mythology in my work, and it's because that heritage is very important to me. My family left Scotland in the mid-1700s, so a long time ago, to go to America, but moving back to Scotland 3 years ago has been a reclamation of that heritage for me. And I think there's a lot, as I look at Scotland's future and the future of the American population, where many are trying to figure out identity from heritage, but also moving forward collectively. That bringing in those things is very important to me, and I think how we move forward with the technology, but so much of our past we don't understand from histories that have been lost, and different ways, and what reclaiming that in a technological world when we think of folklore is so kind of untouchable, has always been very interesting to me.
And it was a little coincidentally, it was a theme across all 3 of our finalists' works, this connection between the history and the present of their characters and the future that science fiction invites us to imagine. Mohammed, your story is called The Interstellar Hajj, which I realize I didn't say in your introduction, sorry. And we'll be hearing a little bit of it in a moment. But what was the appeal for you of doing something similar by drawing on, the long tradition and practice of Islamic pilgrimage in your story in a science fictional setting?
Yes, so I had the privilege of going on Umrah twice in my life. So I went once as a child with my family in, I think it was 2007. And then I went again as a high school student in 2014. And we were just talking about this with Ashraf earlier, how Mecca was unrecognizable to me when I went in 2014 because of the massive development that happened to the city to accommodate the huge increase, exponential increase in the number of pilgrims going annually. So just during the Hajj season alone, between 2007 and 2014, the number of people going went from 2 million to 4 million. So just logistically, it was a huge challenge to accommodate such a big increase. And you can really feel the impact on the city. And I noticed how that impacted the heritage of the city and the history of the city. And I wanted to capture that in the story.
Yeah, which I think you did very well, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit of that in a moment. Zainab, your story doesn't draw on perhaps the stories that are myths or religion that are quite so deep and long as these kind of more ancient versions, but family history is really important. Why was that an element that you chose to include into your story?
So I was thinking of future generations, which is the theme that I was thinking of, and it was about the relationship we have with our mother and daughter. And I was thinking that is also something we think about in terms of creation. So when we create, are we responsible about it? And I wanted to reflect that in the terms of relationship between a mother and a daughter.
That's really good. I think that is really powerful part of your story, which we'll be hearing from next in a moment. To all of you and to my fellow judges as well, what do you think the role, so we've talked about the past, what do you think the role of the present is in helping form science fiction? Like everyone thinks science fiction is about the future. Do you want to add to your
I don't
expand upon your smirk?
Yes, sir. No, it isn't about the future that much. For a very simple reason. Most of the themes that have been classically defining science fiction are realistic nowadays. We're talking about smart machines. We're talking about advancements in medicine. We're talking about the internet. We're talking about space travel. We're talking about inhabiting other planets. So these are things that are on the news nowadays. Science fiction realism may be a term that would be used more often nowadays. And the thing I liked about the three stories and others, it's a pity that you have only top 3. I wish we had top 15 actually, because that's one thing I wanted to mention about the competition in general, and perhaps you would agree with me. There is a number of good quality writing that we've received. What I liked particularly here is that there is a clear linking with the present. There is projection to the past. So his pilgrims perform Hajj by installing their minds into virtual surrogates, in a way, because they cannot afford to travel from a different galaxy that starts with the letter Z, definitely. And your story is about a planet that is formed by debris that is just launched all the way to space to get rid of all the trash. And yours is deep into folklore, definitely. But within all of this, there is a strong link with the present and our current problems, if I may say. So no, it is the present.
you have anything?
What I will add is predominantly particularly when I'm teaching students to write stories that feature not just science, but just the concept of fiction at all is very dependent on extrapolation, right? On taking something and then sort of extrapolating it to a plausible point narratively. And pretty much what we do with science fiction is similar. We just take something that is extrapolated. Pretty much everything we've listened to has done that. And I think it's that action of extrapolation, that's where the work of, that's where the work of imagination lies, especially when you're thinking about science fiction. But you still need a locus for that. You need a particular thing to extrapolate from, which often is what we know and understand, which often is the present and or even history, etc. So even when we're talking about the future or we're imagining the future, we're really talking about the present or something that has existed. But the other thing, or additionally, and this is something that I also liked that across these stories, but also across the board for many of the stories we received, was the investment in locality, in very specificity of place, which meant therefore that there was specificity of identity, culture, and manifestation of these things. And this was actually quite useful because often when we think of science fiction, we think of technology, we think of infrastructure, but these stories were thinking about community, they were thinking about lineage, about stories and how we pass these on. And I liked that they didn't neglect those aspects because in thinking about one, really, you're thinking about the other. Thinking about infrastructure is really having to think about community and how community is going to navigate that infrastructure. So you can't really have one without the other. And I thought it's useful to have that framework. And so I also enjoyed that with these stories as well.
If I can interject here,
Please.
so my story started as a class assignment. Actually, I took a class called Interstellar Politics in college 5 years ago, and the point of that class was to read science fiction novels and use international relations theory to analyze those novels. And so our assignment was to write a short story based on what we've read and what inspired us. So
I hope you got a good grade in that class.
Thankfully, yes, I did for that assignment. And all the stories we read were really about the present. If you thought about it, maybe it's not obvious at the beginning, but upon deeper reflection, you realize that this is a social issue that you will face, and how will society deal with that? And that's why oftentimes science fiction novels are really more about the present than they are about the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, even kind of classics of the genre are often about fears of an enemy or an other, or the development of a technology or something like that. One of the things I think I was struck by across the whole cohort of reading was perhaps a reflection of the present. There was quite a lot of dystopian material, like a lot of societies that had taken a bad path, and I think maybe it's not that hard to look around the world right now and understand why that was. But perhaps one of the reasons we were drawn to your three stories as winners is that I wouldn't say that you three, yours are more complex worlds.
Yeah.
They have issues. Our world has issues. They're often dealing with the after effects of climate change, or what to do with sustainability and waste, or overpopulation and resource management, but they're not negative stories overall. Was that something that was conscious for you to avoid the kind of classic dystopian element? Were you trying to write something positive, or are you just happy people generally?
I can start on this one. I mean, I started writing as a young adult reader when I was in high school in like the very dystopian YA era. So totally get what you're saying, and I think that has still come through. But for me, as I look at all these different futures out there, no matter what, we're going to have conflict. And I think that's where we can kind of get lost in this like dystopian phase of you need conflict in a story, whether that's between people or what it is. And for me, I didn't want that conflict to be stemming from the world. I wanted it to be in between people because that is the human element that I'm pretty sure we're never going to totally solve for, and we shouldn't, because it's that diversity of opinion. It's those other things we're bringing in. And so I think a lot of the world I built for this story is very utopian in its way, and I believe the world is very good for a very strong amount of people. But there's this family that has a little bit of magic in their bloodline and what that kind of means for them and their heritage, and how that fits in. So yeah.
So no, I'm not actually a generally happy person, but I was very conscious about having a hopeful ending. So for me, it was, I drew from the story Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which kind of deals with the same sort of consequences of creation if you're not ethical about it, or you don't understand the responsibility behind it. So that was one of those things I thought about, but I thought in the end, I'll just give a sort of a hopeful twist where the previous generation gives the next generation a sort of a lifeline to hold on to, even though the problems of the world seem impossible to solve. But I just thought that it would be good if we just look at some form of hope in the form of our relationships with others.
Great. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, of course, some people think of as the first science fiction novel. So you bring, the first to one of the newest.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how the problems then are also the problems now and possibly the problems of the future. So.
Did you want to add anything?
So when I was first thinking about my story, I was thinking about how, if it's a challenge to accommodate 4 million people doing the Hajj, how would it be like to accommodate 400 million people doing the Hajj? And the first thing that came to mind was, how do you give water to all of these people? And so the solution was, okay, instead of doing the Hajj in your carbon-based body, you do it in a silicon-based host. And you transfer your consciousness into that host, and you conduct the Hajj, and then when you're done, you transfer your consciousness back into the carbon-based host.
Oops.
This way, you only charge your...
If you keep the connection.
Yes. What if the carbon-based host gets damaged while you're doing the Hajj? Well, you have to get memory insurance just in case. So you have a backup of your whole memory. And what if you can't afford a carbon-based host? Maybe you get a used one, but then maybe there's an issue with it. So it ended up revolving around the consciousness issue. How would you feel when you're inside a silicon-based host? Maybe the one that you purchased can only see and hear, but doesn't actually feel, or maybe something malfunctions on the way, and you lose people throughout that. So that was kind of but my main character was hopeful because she lives in another solar system. She's coming on the Hajj. Her family is wondering, why are you making this long trip? And it's because she wants to find her faith again and explore what it's like to be Muslim in an intergalactic civilization.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing to that, I think we were talking about this last night. Octavia Butler has a great essay on using sci-fi to imagine different futures, and I think she has a quote in there that she talks about of, no matter how awful the world she creates is, her rule is her characters cannot give up hope, and she can't give up hope in that world either as the writer. And I think that is, we were all talking about that last night, of so core to us too as authors.
Exactly.
Yeah, very relevant to bring in Octavia Butler, because she has a novel called Parable of is it Sower or Talents? Which one
Sower.
second? But which has a crazy politician who becomes the president of America with his catchphrase is "Make America Great Again," He's endorsed by the kind of Christian nationalists, and it denies climate change and sows discord. She wrote that in 1998 or something like that. So it's a very timely novel, and yet finds hope. Anyway, let us move on to our next extract, if that's okay.
So the story is called The Lifeline, and I'm just reading a small part where she has a confrontational conversation with her mother. "You and your father were suffocating me," her mother told her over the phone. "That was never the life I wanted for myself." Gerda couldn't bring herself to speak for a moment. Her mother had just answered a question that she had never been able to ask. "Are you trying to make up for all those years by offering me a role in KAI?" "No, even I know it won't make up for it," her mother replied. "I want you to join KAI because we can't deny your talent. We need engineers like you here. I know about the project you're working on, about Luna 2, Gerda told her mother. "And if you need to know anything about me, it is that I would never support it. It is nothing but a technical solution to cover up a problem we created. You're not addressing the fundamental problem of excess creation and consumption." "You're being a traditionalist," her mother replied in a controlled, even voice. "There are consequences to everything, Gerda. We have to move forward, break through if we care for the future generations." "You care more about the future generations than your own child? Why did you give birth to me then, if you knew that life wasn't for you? Wasn't that again some sort of self-indulgent negligence on your part, a solution to your marriage?" Her mother replied after a lengthy pause, "I can't go back in time. Everything that has begun won't just end, you know? You either give up, stop creating, and stop living to let someone else take care of the mess, or you find a solution. That's all I'm trying to do." A few weeks after the phone call, Gerda joined Kai. She had known her opposition was biased, but she also knew that in the realm of science, biases are not to be tolerated. KAI was her best chance of making some sort of a difference, and she was her mother's daughter after all.
Thank you so much for that, Zainab. So as we talked about the kind of multi-generational mother-daughter relationship being so key to your story, it's also about a moon made of waste plastic that's launched into space because that seems easier or more appealing than actually dealing with the problem on Earth. Was that, were you inspired by any particular environmental issues or conversations?
Yes, I mean, it is about creating things, solving for problems, but not really understanding that the solutions will create more problems.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you create something and you have a lot of waste plastic, so you send it up to space, and then there is another problem happening there. So that's the whole concept. Like, you shouldn't probably find solutions that create more problems.
Mm. Yeah, because the other part of the story is your main character on this trash moon, and like the kind of mechanisms that are keeping it gravitationally intact are starting to fail, so they have to go there and try and fix it. And so I really enjoyed how your story flits backwards and forwards between that moment of exploration and peril, and then these kind of more domestic moments in the character's past. It was a really beautiful story, and the ending in particular was quite emotional. So
Thank
thank you very much.
So yeah, what I really appreciated about your story, Zainab, is how there's these two parallel plots happening, and in both situations, the mother is kicking the can down the road in terms of fixing her relationship with her daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and the humanity is kicking the can down the road in terms of fixing the trash problem, and it ends up biting both of them in the back end by the end of the story, which tied it really well.
Thank you. I just wanted, to bring the human element where the mother kind of feels, the daughter feels like she is disposable to her mother. So it's just reflected in the plastic moon.
Yeah.
And I think that the juxtaposition of that, like in terms of the scale too, right? Like the juxtaposition of this large existential thing for the world, for the earth, that's happening in a solar system of sorts. And then there's the small, intimate, domestic concern that sort of grounds that large existential thing. So even when we flit over to this, those scenes where we're thinking about this large plastic space, we feel anchored still because we have that domestic space also anchoring the story in a way. So it didn't really, because that was one of the things I remember we talked about when we were looking at these stories. We're thinking about some of them, the scope being so broad that we didn't feel like we could draw, sort of bring home the concerns that were being raised in those stories because the scope was too big or it was kind of vague. And that's often like a typical terrain with science fiction where the ideas are very big and they're very hard to grasp. But then actually locking it in with something very intimate was quite useful. As I was saying about like finding a way to connect it to the human community, even when that community is literally two people.
Yeah. Well, again, you're right. The thing that made our top stories, not just these three, but many of the top, let's say half, stand out was, or rise above the others, was that element to which the writers were able to introduce those human, relatable moments. And I think that's key to good storytelling, whether it's science fiction or anything else, is that it's about people.
Yes.
And we should be able to see ourselves and see people we recognize in the stories that we are reading, whether they are set here in this museum or whether they're set on another world, very far away. All three of these stories involve relationships between a sister and a brother, or a mother and a daughter, or a mother and a daughter and a daughter. So yeah, I think that's very key. Given the importance of seeing yourself in science fiction, do you think then, that it makes sense that science fiction is such a global genre? Because it does in a way that many popular genres haven't quite thrived. Science fiction does seem to be a lot more global, certainly in the last, or this millennium, than other fictions. Do you feel that coming our diverse global panel that we have here?
It's becoming global, actually.
Yeah.
It's becoming global. In the Arab world, science fiction has been always been viewed as an exported art or craft, if I may say, and this has been further emphasized by drama and TV and Hollywood. There is a huge fan base, definitely, don't get me wrong. But speaking from a literature perspective, it has to relate to the society. It has to speak your language, to have the culture aspect. There is a famous video of Denzel Washington speaking about culture and how culture is different than familiarity. With that being said, I'm happy to say that in the submissions most of the submissions that we've got for this contest, although many or most of them came outside of the Arab world. And by the way, we had no clue whatsoever, all the judges, who wrote what. I mean, we just had
totally
scripts.
Anonymized.
So I thought you were Scandinavian, by the way, judging from the name of the heroine. But with that said, there is a high level of seriousness or maturity in dealing with science fiction. Only one in 200 submissions had an alien.
That's
great.
true.
Huge
There were
improvement,
almost no
huh?
aliens. Yeah.
That's one thing.
A lot of AI, almost no aliens.
A lot of AI. Because of these factors, Glyn, it is becoming a global genre. Because, but I'm revising it now in my head. But it's still a first world genre. Because unless you are connected to the internet, science fiction doesn't touch your life. Unless you have waste management systems or access to fresh water or to electricity, it does not make sense to talk about interstellar Hajj. So perhaps science fiction is a global genre for those in the more fortunate societies to view the world and to make it a better place, I hope.
I'm also thinking a lot about because when I'm trying to get say people who want to be writers or storytellers, and they want to do so within the realm of speculative work, right, including science fiction, what I always try to get them to do is to embody science fiction thinking as sort of a consciousness of sorts. So it's less the specific imagination of future tech or future ways of being, and more a way you think about the world. And what I found is that in a way, each culture, each community has its way of thinking, of forward thinking, which not all of which are always immediately recognized if looked at through the lens of how we, dominant culture and the way dominant science fiction culture thinks about forward thinking, which is why we had all these discussions about like what forward thinking can look like across the spectrum. For example, one of the seminars I teach in Afrocentric futurism thinks about like how Afrocentric societies have actually applied patterns of thinking that have come up with ways of imagining things that may not immediately map onto, say, what we think of when we think of science fiction that comes from, say, North America. And so one of the things I was, again, pleased with was that when each of these storytellers were trying to apply these things to specific localities, some of them were quite aware of how those things manifest in their own specific spaces. But of course, as with dominant culture, some of them also wanted to map on these dominant culture approaches to thinking. I enjoyed seeing that struggle with some of the writers trying to juxtapose those things. I liked the awareness of it. And I think, of course, like some of the stories that we came up with finally were those that were not only aware of it, but tried to embody that consciousness in their thinking. And that's why we had, in my opinion, those stories hit home more for us as judges.
Yeah, and I think on that too, what I was just thinking about as you were saying it is so much of the science fiction I grew up with was very, when you're talking like the off-planet science fiction, like humanity is not on Earth primarily anymore. It has this underlying assumption of humanity's all gotten along and we're like one culture now. And I think what's really exciting of just a lot of the things I've seen coming out more recently and different things is that we are looking at those different cultures, how they show up off planet, but even just more of that near future of how do we even get to that point in the science fiction is really interesting to me. And then getting authors who are from those different cultures that have been kind of often from the West, even just looked at as we're projecting this will be the dominant culture for humanity, and that's the basis we're now going to go write this like crazy off-planet world and story from, but the writers themselves aren't really from that culture. So the more we can globalize science fiction, the better it's going to be.
So you're talking about the stuff you grew up watching. What were the science fiction authors, films, whatever medium you want, but what was the science fiction that influenced you as writers of the genre which you are now?
Sure. So the two authors that I really enjoy reading the works of are Ken Liu and Ted Chiang. They're both Hugo and Nebula Award winners. And I don't know if you heard of Arrival, the film. So Ted Chiang wrote the short story that the movie was based on. And I think they both have these elements of, it's about science fiction, the setting, but the problems are very human.
Great choices. Ted Chiang, in my opinion, is one of the best science fiction short story writers working today. So,
I agree, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a child, the first science fiction-y thing I engaged with was actually most of the Arabs of my generation older know this. It's the show Adnan Walina, which is based on a Japanese anime by Miyazaki, Future Boy Conan, where it was made in 1978. So for him, the future was 2008, but it was imagining a post-apocalyptic world and this friendship that blossomed in the middle of it, as well as Hazim al-Ra'd, which is another really great anime that I grew up watching. But more recently, Ender's Game by Orson Scott. This is a great novel, imagines the internet before the internet was a thing. Really, really interesting. As well as Fahrenheit 451, which I'm rereading right now. Well, he likes to call it speculative fiction, but that's just because he doesn't want to be called science.
Yeah, I haven't left us enough time to get into the weeds of branding and speculative fiction versus science fiction, but yeah, what about?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask this question, so I've been thinking about it a lot and kind of what's helpful for this conversation, because there's so many different paths I could go, but what really keeps coming to mind for me is I'm a young adult writer, kind of at my core. That's the novel I've written. And for me, kind of being in high school, it was the Suzanne Collins with Hunger Games, the Veronica Roth with Divergent, and those books, for me, are still so much of what I go back to. And there's so many writers I've found that I love, and I like them a lot more stylistically and different things, but Hunger Games, sitting at the lunch table at school, because my friends and I were all reading this book, and you're suddenly having a conversation of what is reality TV's effect on us? What does it mean that there are people in our country who are going hungry as an American? And what it did to foster those conversations about a near future. I didn't have the terminology for this when I was 15. But that's when I started writing, and I think that's still so core to me. And then you look at someone like Veronica Roth, who's very much redefined herself a few times, but she has lives in Chicago, which is my hometown, and has 3 different versions of Chicago. That's a fantasy, a sci-fi, and how many times she can just look at this one city and different stories she's working on and completely reimagine what it looks like in the future and alternate reality is really interesting.
No, that is really interesting, and it reminds me of something that Jonathan Keats said in one of the earlier sessions, which was about science fiction's importance for its ability to give us context by putting us in a different position. So we talk about future thinking, but maybe this is actually more like sideways thinking, because it gives us a new viewpoint to better appreciate the world that we're in and give us a vocabulary of ideas in order to kind of look at the world and say, well, does it have to be this way? Or, oh, now I see why that's a problem, or why it's a good thing. What about you guys? I might as well extend it. What science fiction, was kind of keystone for you?
Philip K. Dick.
Philip K. Dick, yeah. Can't go wrong with some Philip K. Dick.
I think I would say Octavia Butler and Nalo Hopkinson, probably. Especially now that I live in Canada, Nalo Hopkinson's work from the 90s has been very crucial to how it has manifested there. So I'm thinking about that a lot currently. So
yeah, Midnight Rob is a great.
Speaking of Canada, Robert J. Sawyer as well.
Robert J. Sawyer, very good. So I hope someone's making a list. You could, for me, you can add in Ursula Le Guin on top of many of the other writers that we've already mentioned, William Gibson, Kim Stanley Robinson as well. Wonderful. I think we are going to go to our final reading. So this is Mohammed's story, The Interstellar Hajj, which won ultimately the top prize. So congratulations. And then I think I might be able to mop up a couple of more comments, but then I do want to throw it out to the audience for some questions as well. So without further ado.
Okay. So Sumaya, the main character, is about to transfer her consciousness into a silicon-based host. So that's where I'm starting in this excerpt. As Sumaya readied herself to transfer her consciousness into a silicon-based host, Suleiman, which is the AI that's managing the transference, began reciting the Quran for her. She leaned back, aligning the cerebral transfer rod, or CTR, to the cognitive access portal between her ears. She read about how this process takes place. The CTR gets access to her brain waves through the occipital nerve, And for tier C, the Hajj or Hajja gets to transfer their cognitive awareness and most of their memories into the host, allowing them to retain their personality and sense of self. For tiers D and E, the cheaper service meant that they were allowed a meager 2 terabytes of non-essential personal memory. When the Hajj Management Committee first introduced these 2 lower tiers, there was an uproar from the Islamic community. But this decision was justified because it allowed the HMC to use older silicon-based host models and hence allow for more people to access and afford the Hajj. Sumaya overheard a family from Tier E discuss this earlier. Well, if we took Tier C, we wouldn't have been able to afford memory insurance back home. I didn't want to risk losing any of you to some accident, said the person who Sumaya assumed was the father. Yes, you're right. Besides, it's just 5 Earth days. We can survive without our childhood memories, possibly, added the mother with a nervous laugh. They all nodded nervously. No one wanted to bring up the obvious. Partial cognitive transference can cause what is known as personality incongruence syndrome. The condition is rare today, since most solar systems don't allow partial transference anymore. Since the HMC received an exemption to continue conducting the procedure, a few thousand Hujjaj end up suffering from this syndrome after every Hajj. Sumaya never saw someone with the syndrome, but she heard that people who get it start to feel disconnected from their older memories. Over time, their personalities change completely, and they become unrecognizable to their friends and families. Half of all Hujjaj, the ones who are in tiers D and E, are playing a numbers game. Of the several 100 million of them, a handful will not return home as the same person that left.
Thank you, Mohammed. I mean, your story was just so thought-provoking and almost dizzying in its scale, much like the Hajj itself. I really enjoyed the way in which you encourage us to think about the boundary between the mind and the self. It's a little Philip K. Dickey in that respect. He's very interested in that question. And the implications of the physical body versus the technological body, the blurring of the boundary between the human and the machine. Is that you talked about being interested in the kind of the global structures and governance elements, but are you particularly interested in that as a technological issue as well?
Yes, well, I work at a think tank at the governance program of that think tank, actually. So this is something I think about on a day-to-day basis. How do we govern the development and transfer of technology across societies, across national borders? How do we deal with sharing water across national borders and those issues? And it's a big issue we face today because, and I don't think we realize this, but when you look at history on a very big scale, these hard borders we live in are very, very new. I mean, less than a century old. If you were born before World War II, you might have been able to travel across the world without facing any borders. So. So governance is a real challenge for us today, and I think, and this goes back to what Glyn was saying earlier, how we imagine that in the future we're going to be one sort of homogeneous civilization, one homogeneous human community, but the way I see it right now is the opposite. We're actually diverging in more ways than we ever did before.
I'm going to throw it over to the audience, but I have one last question for our 3 winners. Having gone on this journey, are you going to keep writing? I mean, you're looking for an agent, so I'm assuming that you will.
Yes, definitely.
Good.
I'll never stop.
Yeah, I am going to keep writing. I'm working on a novel right now, and yeah.
Yeah, good luck.
Yes, this competition definitely inspired me to continue writing.
That is the quote that the organizers want for the next year. So well done. Wonderful. Okay. I could keep going, but are there any questions in the order? Yes, really eager hands over here. So I think we don't have, there are so many of us that we are microphone deficient. So there we go. Be with you now.
I'm Jean Paul Pinto from Quito, Ecuador, South America. I'm a science fiction writer, have 2 novels. And for me, the hard question is that how to find inspiration for writing science fiction. In my case, I have to write my 3rd novel. It's not so easy. In my case, red wine, that's the solution, one of the possible solutions. But I want to know, in your cases, what's your inspiration to write science fiction stories like you did?
Well, for me, it's to get a good grade for the paper.
Yeah.
It's for me. It was also mostly for this story was exploring faith and religion and how it adapts and changes with the times. So it was yeah. That's pretty much it.
For me, I really enjoy science fiction because it kind of pulls you back in perspective. Either you go forward in time or you go into a completely different dimension to really look at what's going on today. So that's the interesting part about science fiction for me.
I have a little bit of training in futures and foresighting. So a lot of times for me, it is that looking at a signal that we've sort of identified in different industries of what life could look like. And as we kind of talked about, we've all written very different time scales of the future. The grandmother in my story is very much who I see potentially I could become as a grandmother. And the things I'm fighting for now, and that are more not about the future, but they're about the now and the current of Scotland. What does that look like for the future? And I always kind of will start with one of those signals or that moment. But then what I love to write is the interpersonal relationships. So then it very much becomes more to me about what does that look like between people, experiencing that, and then the world sort of, I guess, comes up around that.
Great. There was another question, just nice easy move, one over. Anyone else as well? Seen it?
My name is Sam Benny, a fellow futurist. My question is to Mohammed. I mean, this is for far ahead in the future for Interstellar, but what about now for people who are unable to be able to travel to Hajj? Would that be able to put on a virtual headset and someone live going through it and actually experiencing that? I don't know whether this is possible or not, but that's perhaps a good question.
This is more for a jurist, an Islamic jurist, to answer whether something like this is allowed. But I do believe there is a way, if you want, if you're conducting the Hajj, you can do the Hajj on behalf of someone else as well. So if someone passed away, you can do it on their behalf as well. So that's something that happens today. But yeah, it's a real challenge because so many people want to do it, and some people, I think the way it happens today is there's quota systems. Each country gets a certain number of people that it's allowed to give, and so now it ends up being really like mostly elders who get to do it, and many people never get their turn. So thankfully it's not. If you don't get your turn, it's you're not going to go to hell or anything. Like thankfully our religion is merciful in that regard. But I think we have to accept as a society that, as an Islamic community, that the Hajj is not something that you certainly do in your life, even if you really, really want to, until we find a real groundbreaking solution to accommodating as many people as possible without, for example, we saw accidents happen. We really want to avoid that because people have died, during the Hajj because of accidents that have happened there. So, yeah, it requires some deeper reflection within the Islamic community, the Ummah as a whole. I don't know also if anybody else wants to.
May I comment, please? I like this type of question because it just highlights how realistic science fiction is becoming. Let me paraphrase your question. So we're going to settle on Mars quite soon, correct? How do you observe Ramadan on Mars? There is no crescent in the sky. Diwali, Christmas, Thanksgiving. I mean, if you're a devoted religious person. So perhaps, and this brings me to a famous novel by Heinlein, Rendezvous Drama. So I believe that, and speaking of divergence as well, as we spread across the galaxy, there are going to be new races and there are going to be many reset moments for humanity, perhaps. But this is what I like about science fiction. It just opens doors to questions.
Yeah. And your story does allude to those discussions without getting bogged down in the weeds of it. So there are references to, it almost being like doing it as a virtual reality or a video game, and is that acceptable or not? So there is a little bit of that in the story if you read the full.
I just need to correct myself. On Mars, there are actually, I said there is no crescent. There are two. Yeah. There are two moons.
I was going to use this opportunity to add to your question about like how do you get inspiration, and pretty much what we're doing now, where you're looking at something of particular interest. So that's the first point. I always tell my students, like, you have to follow the paths of interest, your own individual paths of interest, but also things that you find are of concern to you or the community that you're involved in, or things that you can actually pinpoint that are not just of interest but of importance at the time, right? And if those things sort of speak to you personally in some way, I'd say follow that. And that often is a very good path. But also the way people are thinking about something and they're coming at this through different angles. You're like a sponge, right? As a creative, you're like a sponge. You're taking in all these ideas, but you're also building yours. You're saying, well, what do I think about how this may manifest? And you bring all these things together. And often when you tell a story from that kind of position, you're really telling a story that only you can really kind of tell, and no one else can. So I'd say that's one way to think about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed a lot of writers over the years, and they all talk about writing the stories they wish they could read that they couldn't find, and writing the story that is inside them that they want to tell, not writing to a trend.
Yeah.
If nothing else, because publishing industry is so slow, by the time your book comes out, the trend will have moved on. So it's just not a good strategy anyway. Yeah. But yeah, that sort of, I guess, creative honesty with yourself does seem to be a consistent amongst writers. Any other questions for anyone? Right here in the middle. You can also ask our judges questions as well if you would like.
Thank you so much for these excellent presentations, your writings actually, and for the panel. My question would be around, so I'm very interested in visual representations and their impact on our imaginations, and you're all writers, but when you were asked who influenced you, there was a mix of sort of authors, but also movies. I'm quite interested to hear from any of you, the new and the established writers, what you think the influence is or might be in this genre around film and imagination. Is it, and what I often wonder is it, it's not about the preference one for the other because I think they're very different, but how do you think they influence or impact positively or negatively on your imaginations and your imaginings?
This is an excellent question, if I may say. To me personally, watching lots of drama and productions helped me to clearly imagine the scene in my head. So I ended up at some stage of my career writing script-like manuscripts. It's dangerous, but it helps a lot. I mean, at the end of the day, you don't want to write a script. But yeah, there is a very strong influence.
I think that, and this is a perennial problem for me because in the classroom, right, one of the biggest challenges I have is trying to get students to think in the medium that I'm trying to actually teach them in, which is literature. But often they're thinking in another medium, like video games or TV.
Yes.
And so I do think, like I said, right, because I think of science fiction as a consciousness of thought, right? So it is an approach, a sort of way you perceive the world, right? I do think that all forms of media contribute to that in their different ways, right? I could see someone developing science fiction thinking through video games or through music, right? So I think that cuts across media. But in terms of thinking about the craft of creating something, then you have to have specific tools of craft in a specific medium. And so someone who wants to write literature needs to know how to do that specifically, even if it's within the realm of science fiction. So I usually draw a line there between those two things. I think science fiction thinking can sort of encompass multiple pieces of media or styles or modalities. But when it comes to like creating something, I think you need to understand the specific rules of craft. And need to do that, you actually have to have engaged with people who have been masters of that craft, etc. So yeah, all this to say, writers need to understand how to write literature as science fiction, but can think about, can embody that consciousness in multiple pieces of media.
I'm going to say yes and to that. I think there's so much that we're seeing as writers of, at least, like the multimedia and the adaptations. And there's been a lot of awful film adaptations of books we all love, I'm sure. And there's been great ones too.
Right.
But I think what's really interesting to me, and I did my graduate research on kind of multimedia fantasy worlds, so a little bit out of sci-fi, but really looking at if we create the world we want the story to operate in, there's so many there's spin-offs, there's different characters, there's different timeline in those worlds. How can you sort of look at that and say, this story, this is the right medium for that? Because film can do things that a novel can't, or vice versa. And then some of my other research was to bring up another controversial thing probably for this panel is with generative AI. I believe writing is my craft. That is my job. That is not the tool's job. But what generative AI can do to help you visualize is what I know is literature, what I know is novel-length fiction. But if I can go to generative AI as a musical theater nerd and say, hey, here's my concept, what does this look like on Broadway? And get stage mock-ups, how that helps me think about the world in a different way to bring into my writing on kind of that proof of concept is really fun.
Do you want to talk about that?
No, we don't have time. Guys, do you want to comment on the question, or you don't have to?
Actually, I mean, for me, it's I do get like visual, imaginative ideas from watching films, but it always translates to how can I put it into words.
Yeah.
So for this particular story, it was set in space, and there was a lone astronaut. So I was really referring to the movie First Man, which is about the moon landing. So really trying to understand how lonely he felt and how new everything was. That was my inspiration from film.
I think you kind of, very similar to what Zainab was saying, is that science fiction in the end is fiction. The difference is the world that you build around it. So, if you start from that standpoint, then it shouldn't be that difficult to make the transition or the switch towards science fiction writing. So yeah, for example, the novel City of Ember, which is written by Jean Duprow, it imagines a city that's under the ground that was built basically to protect humanity because the surface was uninhabitable. And so the people are there for 200 years. And when the events in the city itself, it might as well be any city on the surface. But then you think about the context they're in, and it's all science fiction. So yeah.
Yeah. For me, I think that science fiction is a particularly multimedia genre. The amount of video games that are science fiction video games, you look at the top 10 box office films, or even the top 30, and almost all of them are science fiction if you include superheroes as science fiction, which is a whole other debate. But it's clearly more science fictional than Titanic, which is one of the few non-science fiction films that's in that top listing. So I am a literature scholar. That's what I research. That's what I publish. It's where my home is. But I think the interdisciplinarity of it is part of its strength rather than a detractor. It's just making sure that the creatives working in it, which you'll be very conscious of as someone who teaches creative writing, that they're using the right tools. So yeah, we've read a lot of I've read a lot of material over the years where you're like, oh yeah, you're just writing what you think will make a good Netflix action sequence here. Like it's.
I mean,
like,
you could almost say like a lot of part of what we discussed during the competition was pretty much this, right?
Yeah.
Like taking something from another modality and then trying to apply it to literature, and
Yeah.
it not really quite coming off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the stronger stories achieved that, and the less strong ones,
Yeah.
you could tell that they're probably just inexperienced writers who just are thinking in video game terms or film terms or comic book terms,
Right.
and not quite translating that into what a short story requires. And these were pretty short stories,
Yep.
which is itself a challenge. It's hard to write short.
Indeed.
Do not underestimate the challenge of writing a short story. So yeah, I think that kind of multimedia element of science fiction is to be celebrated, as are our three winners. So I'm going to bring our this session to an end. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending and for spending this hour with us. And please give a round of applause to all of our panelists, but particularly to our three finalists. Thank you very much.
Can you have a group photo, please? I'm dying for this. Thank you.